the age at which people switch from voting Labour to voting Conservative is 65 now on average. So this is a big deal. And you'll have noticed today the Prime Minister talking more about that triple lock rise in April. I think that's an attempt. They've recognised pensioners didn't get enough from the budget.
Where do we start? I mean, I'll tell you what, let's pick up with the budget, which is still relatively fresh in our minds. It's just a few days ago. It feels like months, but that's the nature of the political cycle just at the moment. And when we had that budget and after that budget and days after the budget, we were wondering, will this one do anything to move the dial? I mean, the autumn statement we know didn't move the dial to the advantage of the Conservatives. There have been a couple of polls since that budget, and you've got some fresh stuff too. So what's been the impact or lack of it, Luke?
Well, the extraordinary thing is quite how static the polls have been since the budget. You know, this time last week we were saying it's a bit too early to tell whether there will have been an impact. I think now, over a week later, we can say, you know, it will have trickled through. People have heard about the budget measures, and yet those headline polls haven't shifted at all.
Literally at all.
Literally at all. We had our tracker poll back earlier this week, and it found exactly what it found a fortnight ago, which was the Conservatives on 27, Labour on 42, that lead of 15 totally unchanged. And I think the Conservatives are going to be really disappointed about that because they put so much stock into this budget. You know, it's one of the last set-piece events that they've got to change the public mood, and it just hasn't shifted the dial.
In what sense? It's a particular message that the polls have been static. They haven't gone down. People didn't look at it and think, "Oh, I don't like that," or looked and think, "Well, I like that a little bit." It's just as if the whole thing washed over the head and past the ears of the electorate.
Absolutely. Now, interestingly, though, under some of those headline figures, there does look to be a bit of a movement. And I think one of them will worry the Conservatives the most, which is that if you look at the share of the vote the Conservatives are getting amongst pensioners, that does seem to have ticked down a little bit since the budget. And in fact, we asked the public, who comes out best from the budget and who comes out worst? And right at the bottom was pensioners, like minus 37 net. Come out
How
well.
much of a move are we talking here among pensioners? How much?
In some, it's quite significant. It's sort of, you know, in the sort of 5 to 10 points among pensioners,
that's a lot.
which is really significant. And they are, of course, we know pensioners vote, and we also know they vote Tory. In fact, the age at which people switch from voting Labour to voting Conservative is 65 now on average. So this is a big deal. And you'll have noticed today the Prime Minister talking more about that triple lock rise in April. I think that's an attempt. They've recognised pensioners didn't get enough from the budget. We need to start talking up what pensioners are getting.
Right, that 10-point slip, which is well beyond the margin of error.
Absolutely.
So something on those numbers seems to have happened, and it's just since the budget. So one can reasonably assume it is because of the budget, and the big measure in the budget was a cut in national insurance, which of course does not help pensioners. So, I mean, those pensioners, if they've deserted, you know, the Tory cause, where have they gone?
Well, I mean, as ever, they're going sort of all over the place. Some will go to Don't Know, some will go to Reform, some will go to Labour. But it is interesting, when we spoke literally the night of the budget and we'd done that focus group in Whitby, there were a couple of pensioners in there saying, where's the thing for me in this? What am I getting out of it? And we wondered, was that going to become a trend? I think we can say, looking at, and it's across pollsters, it's not just our poll, it's across other polls as well, there has definitely been a hit to the Tory poll ratings amongst pensioners.
And the reliance on that older vote has been quite enormous, because the disparity between those who are supporting the Conservatives and those who are not, and the under 50s, never mind those we call young, is enormous. I mean, I recall the number of the under 50s, the proportion supporting Labour as against the Conservatives was 6-1 in favour of Labour. And when you get down to, you know, people who are genuinely young, I don't know, in their sort of teens up to the mid-20s, it's vast. It's way beyond that.
It's tiny number of young people still supporting the Conservatives. And I think that's a real challenge. It takes a very brave political party to challenge their base, particularly when you're in the position the Conservatives are in at the moment. It does seem like the budget might have done that. As I say, I think they'll be hoping it's a blip, and when that triple lock rise comes in April and pensioners get that extra 10%, they'll be feeling better off. But it's not a good thing to have come out of the budget for them, certainly.
All right, now what about your numbers on the question of who is trusted to run the British economy? Now, I've been getting a sense that look, people may not be happy with the Tories. That doesn't mean they love Labour as an alternative on this, which is a point worth making. What does your data tell us?
Absolutely. So we asked, given people were a bit sort of meh about the budget, do you think that Labour would have done a better job? And the interesting thing is only 28% said they thought Labour would have done a better job. 22% said they'd have done a worse job, and the rest were don't know, about the same. So only 6% more said done better than done worse. And again, that matches what we hear in the focus groups, right? People say that they're fed up of the Tories, they're frustrated with the cost of living crisis, but they're just not sure that Labour would do better. And the really interesting thing we did in this poll is there's that famous Ronald Reagan question. Ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Yes.
Well, we asked, are you better off than you were 14 years ago when the Tories came into office? And 56% said that they felt worse off. Only a quarter felt better off. And that quarter actually broadly matches where the Conservative share of the vote is now, right? It was even worse when we asked how is the country doing. It was in the 70s saying worse off. So a really gloomy picture in terms of how people assess their own well-being after 14 years of the Tories being in power.
And on tax, let's talk tax, because there's been an interesting, what do you call it? I wouldn't call it a debate between the Prime Minister and his Chancellor, but certainly maybe a difference of emphasis. The budget hinted at cuts in national insurance to come, and then the Chancellor seemed to be winding back away from that. Most recently, yesterday, it would take many parliaments, to get rid of national insurance if it ever happened. And the Prime Minister seems a little bit more keen on the idea, maybe believing that was what people want to hear. But you can now tell us what people are thinking about who is seen as a low-tax party right now.
Okay. And this is really interesting, and this will really worry the Conservatives. If they had one thing to their brand that you associate with the Conservatives, it's they're the lower tax party and the Labour Party are higher tax and higher spending. Actually, we asked in a poll, do you associate the Conservatives with being high tax or low tax? And 48% said high tax. That compares with just 31% saying low tax, so more people saying high than low. But really interestingly, when we asked about the Labour Party, only 42% said they were a high tax party. So what that means is the public are now more likely to say the Conservatives are a high tax party than the Labour Party. That's quite a turnaround.
Well, so far, this is pretty encouraging from Labour's point of view. Now, look, if you were giving a presentation right now in Number 10 Downing Street to the Prime Minister and his Chancellor and his top team, looking for some signs of encouragement, there's always something there for strategies if you're looking for something to be optimistic about. What can you offer the government side that may offer them some grounds for whatever brilliance of optimism?
Well, as we said last week, actually lots of the individual measures in the budget were popular. The national insurance cut on the face of it was popular, as was cutting the non-dom tax relief as well. The extension of the windfall tax was popular. So it was a popular package. And if I were advising Downing Street, I would say what you should do is see this in the round. You've got, rather than seeing the budget as a game changer, put this in the context of falling inflation, hopefully interest rates about to come down, that energy price cap coming down as well. Because we know we're in an era when people don't trust headline announcements by politicians until they feel it in their pocket. So even though it doesn't look from the data we've seen that many voters want to stick with the plan at the moment, I actually think it's the Conservatives' best approach, just to keep on doing it, to keep on hoping that the economy gets better. And remember that despite the fact they are far behind in the polls, there still isn't a lot of love for the Labour Party. People are voting Labour out of default, not because they love Keir Starmer and what the Labour Party has to offer.
Well, we have heard from the Prime Minister just in the last few minutes, he's ruling out, maybe not a huge surprise, but he's ruled out and made the second general election the same day as the local election. So it looks as if his idea is where you might imagine it sensibly would be to play it a little bit longer and hope for moods to shift.
Absolutely. I mean, I would have been astounded had he called an election next week
Well,
or
me too.
the week after, because I mean, you just don't when you're so far behind in the polls. And the Conservatives now have to hope that with that longer time period, more things go right. I mean, we've talked about the economy. Of course, the other thing which could happen is a flight gets off the ground and goes to Rwanda, and that policy starts to work. Now, that's high risk. If it doesn't act as a deterrent, the public will be angry. But it is interesting that in focus groups and polling, there is this real sort of cynicism that the Rwanda plan will work. And I just wonder if they can show at least some progress. Some of those voters who've gone to Reform UK might think, you know what, actually, they said they would do this. They've done it. It comes back. So it's those things going right in the future that will turn things around. Where we are right now, it just isn't fertile ground for
I guess
election.
there's also a little bit more time for Keir Starmer to lose a bit of weight if he wants to and get a bit fitter. I don't suggest for a moment that Keir Starmer needs to lose weight, but Peter Mandelson did the other day, didn't he, on Matt Chorley's podcast? And you've done some sounding out of what people think about that.
Yeah, we were really interested in what the public thought about Peter Mandelson's comments and whether it was appropriate to ask a political leader or to suggest they should lose weight. I think quite reassuringly, overwhelmingly, the public thought that it wasn't an appropriate thing to ask a political leader to. And interestingly, in a list of attributes in political leaders, they actually said that being physically fit was the least important for them. They much more cared about what people had to say, what they were going to do.
Well, you'd hope so,
than their appearance. But there were some interesting differences in there. People did think, for instance, it's okay to encourage your friends and family to lose weight. And interestingly, we found that men who are graduates are much more likely to think it's okay to say that a political leader should have to lose weight than any other group. Why that is,
I'm trying to get my head around that. Why would that be, I wonder?
So men were overall much more likely to say it was appropriate to say it, and in particular graduate men and men who live in London. Londoners are apparently much more comfortable with talking about people's weight than elsewhere.
Reflect on that one. Now, look, we've still got time to talk about one of the big figures in the news just now, which is Lee Anderson, who's defected to Reform. He crossed the floor physically. He's over on the other side of the House of Commons now, sitting next to George Galloway, by the way. And you've done some polling on what people think about Lee Anderson, and now having deserted the Tories in that constituency, he should have a by-election. What did you find there?
Oh, well, this was actually some Ipsos polling which asked voters, do you think, given an MP has crossed the floor, should they call a by-election? And over 60% said there should be a by-election. They felt that Lee Anderson, having switched the party that he was elected to, it's only right that he calls a by-election.
Yes.
Interestingly, though, and I think this poses a bit of a dilemma for Reform UK, they also polled on how well known Lee Anderson was. And it was still relatively low. It was about 30%, so it was below Nigel Farage, but it was almost double that who knew who Richard Tice was. So Reform now have this MP and this figurehead who is actually much more well known than their leader. And of course, we remember the last time that this happened with UKIP, a long time ago, when they brought in Robert Kilroy-Silk.
Yes.
That actually was a bit of a recipe for tensions in the party when you had a figurehead who was more well known than the party leadership.
Yeah.